All right, so welcome to our fourth economic geography lecture. And in this lecture, we're going to be looking at international development. So we're basically expanding our view to the global scale and looking at economic differences between countries and regions across our entire world. So specifically, we're going to start by talking about how we measure economic development. What are some of the indicators that we use to see which countries are rich and which countries are poor? Then we're going to talk about colonialism, which is the process that is responsible for the broad scale pattern of wealth and poverty around the world that we see today. Then we're going to examine some of the approaches that have been taken by different countries to promote economic development and look specifically at two of the major ones, which are import substitution and structural adjustment. We will touch on the idea of the resource curse, which is a phenomenon in which a country with lots of natural resources can end up with a economy that isn't doing so well. And we'll wrap up by talking a bit about the role of foreign aid and charity in international development. So to start off, the most common measurement that we use for comparing different economies around the world is GDP, and that stands for Gross Domestic Product. So GDP is a measurement of the total value of all the buying and selling that goes on within a country during a particular year. So this map is from 2018. So you add up the monetary value of everything that was bought and sold within each country within that year, and you're measuring them based on equivalencies between the currencies of different countries. And the map there is actually per capita GDP. So it's very common that when we are comparing countries using GDP, we divide it by the population to get a per capita GDP, since obviously a country with more people in it, all else equal, with the exact same sort of economy as another country with fewer people, will have a larger GDP. And so but it's per capita GDP that really gives us an indication of the wealth level actually experienced by people in that country. So as I said, GDP is a measurement of everything that gets bought and sold within that country during that year. So that means there's a lot of economic activity. If we think back to our broad definition of economics as the management of scarcity, there's a lot of economic activity that's not going to be captured within GDP statistics. So some of that is simply because it falls outside of what the statistics collectors are going to be able to access. So for example, economic activity on the black market. Somebody buys some illegal drugs or something. That's not going to go into GDP because you're obviously not reporting that to the government. You're not filling out like sales tax forms and sending in your sales tax on the heroin that you sold to somebody on the street. And in some countries, that black market, or the more common and less loaded term is the informal economy. That informal economy can be a pretty big sector of the economy. GDP also doesn't capture economic activity that doesn't involve the exchange of money. So if I were to have an exchange with my neighbor where I mowed my neighbor's lawn and in exchange my neighbor babysat my kids, that would not fall into GDP because no money changed hands. But on the other hand, if I were to pay my neighbor $20 to watch my kids, and then my neighbor paid me $20 to mow their lawn, comes out kind of the same in the end in terms of who gets what. But now that there's an exchange of money, that could potentially go into GDP as long as the people collecting the statistics were aware of that transaction. If we send it through PayPal or something where it gets into the official system there. And the fact that GDP doesn't count these non-monetary transactions has been a source of critique by feminist researchers, because a lot of this unpaid work in the economy is typically work that's done by women. So all of the work in raising children and maintaining the household that is traditionally done by women is not going to go into GDP, and so it's not going to get counted as part of the economy. But on the other hand, if you start to make that work something that is monetized, if you start to hire people for money to do it, then suddenly it becomes part of GDP statistics. So it's important to remember that GDP, it's a measurement of the amount of buying and selling that's going on, but it doesn't capture everything that's going on in the economy. Another thing that GDP isn't capturing is the distribution of this economic activity. So you could have two countries with very similar GDPs, but the typical person in one of those countries may be much worse off than another. And a really clear example that you can see by looking at the map there is the country of Saudi Arabia. So it is right here, if you can see my pointer, and you can see that Saudi Arabia is in a similar color to a country like, say, Sweden. So they have similar GDP per capita. But the typical person in Saudi Arabia is much poorer than the typical person in Sweden. And that's because within Sweden, the GDP that's generated within the Swedish economy is shared among the Swedish people much more than it is in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, you have a very small number of very rich people that control enormous amounts of wealth, whereas the typical person there doesn't have access to that wealth. So you have a much greater inequality of the distribution of the GDP in that country in some places than others. And so we can measure that inequality with something called the Gini coefficient. And so you can see here from this map, unfortunately, the folks that made this map didn't have adequate data to establish Gini coefficient for Saudi Arabia, but you can see that Sweden has one of the lower Gini coefficients in the world. That means that, comparatively speaking, it's a fairly economically equal society. There aren't so many super rich people or super poor people there. You can see the United States kind of falling in the middle, and then some countries, especially in Southern Africa and Middle and South America, have some of the higher Gini coefficients in the world. So the Gini coefficient is named after an Italian economist named Corrado Gini. So it's not an acronym. You shouldn't spell it with all capital letters. It's just the guy's last name that came up with it. And it measures the level of inequality in distribution of the GDP within a country. So a Gini coefficient of 0 would mean perfect equality. Everyone has exactly the same amount of wealth as everyone else. Gini coefficient of 1 would be perfect inequality. One person controls the entire wealth of the entire country and everyone else has nothing at all. So it's a coefficient. It has no units to it, right? GDP is, measured in like dollars or something like that. Gini coefficient has no units to it. It's just a range from 0, meaning perfect equality, to 1, meaning perfect inequality. So that gives you a sense of how that GDP is distributed within the country. And then the third measurement of economic development that I want to talk about is the Human Development Index. So this was developed on the theory that money isn't everything. Right? Money isn't the only thing that people want out of life, even if we're just looking at people's material standards of living. Right? So we're setting aside questions about does money buy happiness and all that kind of stuff. Right? There are also measures of subjective happiness where they survey people and ask how happy are you. But if we're just looking even at material standards of living, money isn't everything. So the Human Development Index is a composite index that brings together measurements of life expectancy, income, and education. So the idea is that income is part of it. Good material standard of living requires having some money to spend. But we're also going to incorporate life expectancy. So we're interested in, does this economic prosperity translate into better health for people? So life expectancy is a fairly simple and easy to calculate general measure of health, right? Because if people are less healthy, chances are, on average, they're not going to live as long. So we've got life expectancy in there, and then we've got education, which is a good indicator of whether people are sort of doing self-development, whether they are improving themselves by using the resources at their disposal. So the Human Development Index is a composite of those three things that's aiming to be a broader indicator of the material standard of living that people have than just purely based on money that that changes hands, as you would see with something like GDP. And there are a variety of other indicators that are out there. People have tried to come up with their own indicators to get at what they think is sort of the true definition of economic prosperity. And one of the catches with some of these other indicators is the more complicated they get, the less likely you are to have adequate data to calculate these indicators for all countries. And poorer countries in particular tend to have less access to good quality data that you can use. So you'll sometimes see maps like this where a whole bunch of countries are missing data because there's just not the right data to calculate this. But if you can't calculate it for all countries, it becomes a less useful indicator. So as we've been looking at these maps, we can see the basis for one of the major questions in the social sciences, one that has been asked for hundreds of years, which is why are some parts of the world rich and others are poor? And there's a whole bunch of different theories that have been proposed over the years to try to explain this global economic inequality. So one theory is a biological or racial theory. It says that some people are just kind of better people, that they're more hardworking, that they're more rational or smarter, and so therefore they can do better in their economy, and other people are just, inherently, lazy or stupid or emotional or whatever other quality that makes them unable to really have a good, prosperous economy. Now, that's a theory that has a long history of being used because it's very complementary to whoever proposes this theory to say that me and the people like me are racially superior to others. But it's a theory that has no basis. It's a theory that I'm only mentioning because it has in fact been talked about so much, and lots of people implicitly believe it, even if they wouldn't explicitly endorse it. And so I want to highlight it, kind of call it out to reject the idea that there's some sort of fundamental biological or racial difference between people in different parts of the world that could explain why some areas are rich and others are poor. Another very common theory is that it's on the basis of the natural environment of various parts of the world. And this theory goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. They had environmental determinist theories as to why some parts of the world were prosperous and others were not. And there's kind of two different types of environmental determinist theories that you can run across. So one is a resource endowment theory that says certain parts of the world just have a better endowment of natural resources and have thus had more access to this kind of natural capital that they've been able to use to build their wealth. This is something that seems very intuitively plausible, that having more natural resources will help you out and lacking natural resources will hold you back. But in fact, when we look at economic development in different parts of the world, we find that resource endowment doesn't necessarily correlate with economic prosperity. And in fact, sometimes it will be a negative correlation. And so we're going to talk later about the concept of the resource curse, why countries that have lots of natural resources sometimes end up poorer than those with less natural resource endowment. And so the reason for that is that, number one, just having resources present in your country is not the same as being able to effectively make use of them. And number two, the location of the resources is not always the same as the location of the people that control and profit from those resources. In many cases, a country can get rich by exploiting the resources in a different country. So the inherent resource endowment of a country doesn't necessarily tell you anything about its likely economic prosperity. The other branch of environmental determinism is the climate theory. And so the climate theory is something that was extremely popular in the discipline of geography in the very beginning of the 20th century. And it has become kind of an embarrassment to the discipline. And it led to a lot of geography departments in a lot of schools getting actually eliminated because they were promoting this ridiculous theory, and it kind of undercut respect for the discipline. And so that's why if you look at the Ivy League schools, for example, they used to all have geography departments, but now only Dartmouth out of all the Ivy League schools still has a geography department. Geography mostly stuck around in schools like Slippery Rock that were educating teachers. And so teachers needed basic geography knowledge so that they could, teach geography and social studies classes in elementary and high school. And so that's kind of where the discipline of geography hung on after this kind of crisis brought about by the rejection of the climate theory, which held that temperate climates are more stimulating to people and will lead to more innovation and economic success, whereas warm tropical climates make people lazy and unwilling to do the hard work of promoting their economy. That's, in very broad strokes, what the climate theory held. And so that theory also has no empirical basis. It was soundly rejected once people started to really dig into, does this actually line up with the facts of our world? So it's not simply the quality of the natural environment that will make some places rich and other places poor. There's also cultural theories that claim that there is something special about the culture of certain regions of the world that leads them to be more economically prosperous. And so a lot of versions of this cultural theory will claim that there's something in particular that derives from ancient Greek philosophy that has percolated into European culture and has led to European economies being more successful. And usually people will cite something along the lines of individualism or rationalism as this legacy of ancient Greek philosophy that has blossomed into economic prosperity for the European heirs to Greece. The problems with cultural theories is that they have a lot of trouble explaining changes in what parts of the world are rich and which parts are poor. So especially if you're claiming this long legacy going back to the ancient Greeks, it's hard to explain why Europe was not, in fact, the most prosperous part of the world for a very long time. It's only a fairly recent development that Europe and neo-European societies like the United States have become the richest parts of the world. And then that also doesn't explain the rise of non-European societies that don't have this Greek heritage, like first Japan and then in the present time China. And so proponents of these cultural theories have often had to sort of scramble to make up sort of post hoc explanations of why there's something else about some other culture that they can tack onto their theory to help explain changing economic fortunes in different parts of the world. So then the final theory, which is the one that I want to propose is the best explanation for how we got the particular pattern of rich and poor countries around the world today, is colonialism. So let's look at what colonialism is. In basic terms, colonialism is the forcible takeover of another society, followed by reorganizing the colony's economy to benefit the colonizer. So if one country, one society goes out and conquers somebody else and reorganizes the economy of the folks they conquered in order to bring wealth to the colonizer, right? To extract wealth from the colony that they took over, that is colonialism. And so colonialism as a process goes back as far as people have had the weapons and the sort of military organization to go conquer other people. Now we have colonial types of activity going all the way back to the ancient Sumerians and Egyptians. But colonialism has expanded to become a dominant global phenomenon over the last half millennium or so. So when you have colonialism, you can end up with a situation of what's called unequal exchange. And so this idea is popularized, among others, by the Egyptian economist Samir Amin. And the idea of unequal exchange is that the value exported by the colony back to the colonizer is greater than what goes the other way. So the rich get richer by making the poor poorer. So there is this, the trade that goes on, the exchange of goods between the colony and the colonizer, is done to the disadvantage of the colony. The colony is losing out on this trade. They're not getting back as much value as they are given out. And so a key thing about this then is that the economic fortunes of the rich and poor are linked to each other. Right? So the rich get rich by making the poor poorer. And that's in contrast with evolutionary models of development. And so we talked a little bit in our last lesson about the idea of an evolutionary model where there's this trajectory that all societies are expected to follow, and it's just that some societies have gotten farther along that trajectory because they started sooner or moved faster, and other societies are lagging behind, but eventually we expect them to catch up. So when we were looking at the changes in the dominance of different sectors in the economy, for example, we were talking about that in kind of an evolutionary framework where the United States had moved from primary dominated to secondary dominated to tertiary dominated. Other societies may still be in primary dominated or have moved from primary to secondary dominated, but if we give them enough time, they're going to move through the rest of the stages and catch up to where the United States is. Maybe by that time the United States will have moved on to something else too, but it's this sort of single track that everybody's following just at different speeds. That's an evolutionary sort of model, and it assumes that each society is kind of doing its own thing. Right? It has its own internal trajectory of development that may be faster or slower than others. But colonialism forces us to think about the interactions among societies and to say, well, did some societies get ahead by holding others back, rather than simply running faster, right? So if you imagine in the context of a race, an evolutionary model says each runner stays in their own lane and some people are just faster runners than others. Colonialism proposes a model more like some people are winning the race because they are tripping or pushing off on their fellow runners to get ahead and therefore shoving the others back. And when we have these sorts of colonies, it's useful to distinguish two types of colonies. So one type is the extractive colony. So this is the most common type of colony, and it's one where it's ruled by the colonizer in order to obtain resources and make use of the labor of the indigenous population. So only a small number of people from the colonizer will end up going to the extractive colony. They're just kind of, the government people and the owners of the businesses that set up there and so forth. And they're there to sort of manage things on behalf of the colonizer country. But the predominant population is of the indigenous people of that colony, or the people that were there before it got taken over. So that's an extractive colony. On the other hand, you can have a settler colony. In a settler colony, the goal is to displace the indigenous population, right? To kill them or expel them from the land so that people from the colonizer country can move in and settle there. So if you look at the history of British colonialism, for example, you would have, say, India as an example of an extractive colony. A very small number of British people went to India while it was a British colony to run the show, to be in charge of the government and economic enterprises and stuff. But the vast majority of people remained the native Indian people, and it's true till today, right? There's not a large white population in India. On the other hand, the United States is a good example of a settler colony. So when Britain took over the United States, Native American people were pushed out, were killed, were expelled westward so that land would be available for British people to come and settle in. And so today the United States population is majority white. It's majority these settlers that came over from, initially predominantly from Britain, but later from other parts of Europe as well. We may now make up the majority population in the United States, and the population of Native Americans is something like 1% of the United States population today. So we have a difference between an extractive colony and a settler colony. So a lot of this thinking draws on something called world systems theory, and I've got a kind of a diagram of it there. And so world systems theory is developed by a number of people, including Immanuel Wallerstein and Andre Gunder Frank. And the basic idea of world systems theory is that you have a world economy. And so I put world in quotation marks there because a world economy in world systems theory doesn't necessarily encompass the entire globe, but it encompasses all of the areas that are economically interacting in a substantial kind of way. So if there are other parts of the world that you're not engaged in significant trade with, they're not part of your world for the purposes of world systems theory. They're outside of your world because they're not interacting economically with you. But this world goes beyond the borders of just any one country or tribe or whatever sort of political organization. So you have lots of different areas all engaged in trade and economic interaction with each other that form this world. And within one of these worlds, you have a differentiation into a core and a periphery, often with a semi-periphery kind of in between as kind of a mediator between those. So the core is the area that is in charge. They are exerting power over the rest of this economic world, and profits tend to flow towards the core. And the periphery is kind of the opposite. The periphery is subject to the domination of the core's power, and profit is extracted from the periphery to go towards the core. So before European countries began to expand around the world, we can look at the Eastern Hemisphere and we can see that we had a world economy, so a set of economically interacting societies that encompass pretty much the whole Eastern Hemisphere by about the 1300s. And there's lots of debate among historians about, exactly at what point can we say that the whole Eastern Hemisphere, with the exception of some more remote areas like Siberia and Australia, by what point can we say that this is all fully interacting in a single world economy? But certainly by the 1300s, that was the case. We had long distance trade crossing the entirety of Eurasia, all the way from Britain and Spain in the far west out to Japan, Korea, China in the far east, and then also extending southward into Africa, both across the Sahara into West Africa and down the Indian Ocean coast of Africa as well. So we had this integrated economic world within the Eastern Hemisphere. And in that world economy, the core was located in China and India. So those were the areas that were the most developed, the most prosperous. They had the most wealth. They were producing the most goods. Europe was more of a periphery or semi-periphery, depending on what part of Europe you're looking at. So Europe was not the dominant part of this world economy. But Europe wanted to be. Everybody wants to be the core. Everybody wants to dominate the economic network that you're part of. But in order to do that, Europe needed two things. Because they wanted to expand their trade with China and India in order to move up the economic ladder. But they had two problems. One was there wasn't a good route for them to get to China and India, because you have Africa and the Middle East kind of in the way. So long distance trade worked best by ship, because you can load lots of goods onto your ship and travel a lot more easily and cheaply than you can overland if you have to load everything into wagons or camels or something. But it's real difficult to go from Europe to India or China by ship, especially with the sailing technology of the 1300s, 1400s, and so forth. Right? It's a very long trip if you were to go all the way down around the bottom of Africa. Nobody from Europe had done it, at least since the time of the ancient Greeks and Phoenicians. There's some possibilities that some of them may have circumnavigated Africa, but it wasn't really a practical thing. So you had this landmass in your way if you wanted to try to sail there. So you'd really have to go and take all your goods off your ship at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, truck them overland across the Middle East, and then put them on another ship in the Indian Ocean. And the rulers of that area by this point were mostly Muslim, and they were in conflict with the Christian rulers in Europe. So it wasn't a sure thing that you could just go and take your goods across there. They might block you, they might charge you exorbitant fees to cross. So it was difficult to actually get there. The second thing that Europe lacked in terms of getting into trade with China and India was any goods that they could exchange with China and India. Because Europe made a lot of products, but China and India could make better ones. So Europe could make ceramics, but China could make better ceramics. Europe could make metal goods, but China could make better metal goods. So Europe could make textiles, but China was making better textiles. It was in fact these better Chinese and Indian products that were what the Europeans wanted. They needed to find something that they could trade with China and India that these countries would actually want. So there are these two issues that Europeans had. And things started to change with the voyage of Christopher Columbus. And it's important to note that Columbus's voyage was based on a mistake. So I know that I learned when I was in elementary school that Columbus was a genius who realized that the earth was round and therefore he could sail westward to China when everybody around him thought the world was flat and that he was going to fall off the edge of it. And that's why nobody had tried it before, and that's why it was hard for him to find someone to sponsor his voyage and all this kind of stuff. You may have learned some of the same things as well. I'm not sure exactly what is being taught in all of the elementary schools these days, but that is absolutely not true. It is a complete myth. It was made up by Washington Irving, the guy that wrote the Headless Horseman story, because he wanted to make people in the past look stupid. So he promoted this idea that Europeans in the Middle Ages were all flat earthers. They were not. Any educated person in medieval Europe knew that the world was a sphere, or roughly spherical. So the debate had nothing to do with the roundness of the earth. Everybody knew that in principle you could go westward from Europe and eventually come around to East Asia. The real issue was, how big is the world? Right? How long would that journey be going westward? And so that depends both on just the total size of the Earth and also the distance from, what percentage of that distance is occupied by Eurasia. Because at this point in time, it was very difficult to calculate longitude. It was real easy to calculate latitude based on the stars. It was very difficult to calculate longitude. And so there's a lot of debate about just how wide Eurasia is. How many miles is it eastward from Europe to China, and therefore how many more miles would it be to go westward around the other side? And so the reason that people hadn't tried this before Columbus was that they all believed correctly that the world was really big. And so with the sailing technology of the time, you were unlikely to make it all the way across to China if there was nothing but ocean westward from Europe. Columbus had gotten this idea from this other opinion that said the world is smaller, that it would actually be a much shorter voyage. And so what you see on the screen there is a map by a cartographer, Paolo del Pozzo Toscanelli, who was one of the proponents of this smaller Earth theory. And it's believed that Columbus drew on his ideas and his maps to come to the conclusion that he could, in fact, sail westward and make it with the technology he had at the time. And this version of the map has placed the actual outline of the Americas on there to give you a sense of, first, of how wrong this map is, because it's putting what's labeled there Sipangu, that is Japan, and then Cathay is China. So these are old European names for those countries. You can see it's putting them just about where the Americas are. They're, of course, way off the map, off to the left, because you got the whole Pacific Ocean in there. And so Columbus got kind of lucky from a sort of, personal point of view, that there was something else in between, that he did, in fact, run into the Americas before he got lost crossing this long distance of ocean. And so he failed at finding a better route to get to China and India, which was the branch of that dilemma that he was trying to solve. But he did succeed at solving the other branch, which is, what can Europeans trade to China and India once they get there? By stumbling across these two other continents that nobody else in the Eastern Hemisphere had known about at the time, Columbus allowed Europeans to begin to colonize the Americas. So the Americas were taken over by various European powers, and you can see on that map a little bit of who took over what areas. And by making these into colonies, European countries were able to extract resources from them that they were then able to trade with India and China. So colonialism in the Americas really boosted the economies of the European countries that were involved in it, both directly involved by actually establishing colonies. So you can see, France, Spain, Britain, Portugal, some of the major colonial powers, but even the other European countries that didn't directly establish American colonies benefited indirectly because they were heavily involved in trade with the colonizer countries. So they were, became banks where that money would be, put into, and then they benefited from that. They made other products that they'd sell to the colonial empires and so forth. So it brought a lot of prosperity into Europe by having these American colonies that they just kind of lucked into, that the Americas were located so close to Europe that they could easily be colonized by Europeans. And on this map, you also see another European colonial empire spreading the other direction, which is Russia. So Russia couldn't easily sail across to the Americas. They didn't have they only had really one westward-facing port at St. Petersburg, which was way back inside the Baltic Sea, so it's very difficult for them to get all the way over there. So instead, they turned the other way, and they turned to Siberia and Central Asia, and began to establish a colonial empire in those areas on sort of similar terms to the way that Britain and Spain and so forth colonized the Americas. So this colonialism in the America involved a genocide of the indigenous people. And so this was carried out partly through war, just like directly killing people to take their land. It involved the theft of land and resources that undermined the economic base of indigenous societies, and through the spread of disease. So there were a whole bunch of diseases that were common among Europeans and Asians and Africans, mostly derived originally from livestock. So a lot of these things like smallpox, influenza, measles, that Europeans were bringing over to the Americas were originally livestock diseases. They were diseases from cattle and pigs and chickens and so forth. But because Europeans had this livestock for a very long time, they had adapted to those diseases. They were serious diseases, but they weren't pandemics that would wipe out huge numbers of people. The indigenous people in the Americas had never been exposed to these diseases before. They didn't have large herds of livestock that they could acquire these diseases from, or some other disease that Europeans could have caught from them. And so disease was kind of a one-way killer. It killed sometimes as much as 95% of some tribes were lost to these waves of disease that came through, sometimes spreading even faster than European explorers actually made it. So they would come across tribes that had already been devastated by diseases that spread through indigenous trade networks faster than Europeans actually came into these areas. And this was such a large-scale phenomenon. So many people died from these various causes that it's actually hypothesized that this may have affected the global climate. So these indigenous populations were doing things like clearing land for farms and conducting controlled burning in forests and grasslands and so forth to promote growth of certain plants and attract animals to hunt and various kinds of things. And all this put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and enhance the greenhouse effect a little bit. If you suddenly kill off a lot of these people, well, these areas they cleared for farmlands are going to start to grow back. You're going to get trees returning. If they're no longer able to burn lots of land, then that burning's not going to occur. That CO2 is not going to be released, and so you're going to have CO2 pulled out of the atmosphere by this growth that's going to happen in these lands that get abandoned due to population collapse. And that is going to reduce the greenhouse effect. And so the global climate cooled off shortly after European colonialism began. And that may, in fact, even be one of the explanations for why the Norse colony in Greenland collapsed. One of the reasons that it got too cold for the Vikings in Greenland may have been because huge numbers of indigenous people in, say, the Amazon died and were no longer able to keep their farms cleared, and so trees grew and took CO2 out of the atmosphere. So this is a somewhat disputed hypothesis, but it's a very interesting one about the global interconnections of human activity, economics, climate, colonialism, and so forth. So when the Europeans came to the Americas, the first thing that they were really interested in was silver, because that was the biggest thing that China and India wanted. Their economies ran on a silver standard, but they didn't have a lot of silver of their own. On the other hand, the Americas had a ton of silver, and the Aztec and Inca empires in particular had located and extracted a whole lot of gold and silver within their territories. And so when the Spanish took those areas over, they started to mine that silver even faster, and they would put it into this global trade network where it would eventually flow to China. So huge amounts of American silver made its way to China, either going eastward to Europe, then to the Middle East, then to India, and eventually on to China, or going directly westward across the Pacific. That's one of the reasons that the Spanish took over the Philippines, was to have a kind of a trade depot where they could bring this silver to across the Pacific before sending it on to China. So this allowed Europe to get into more trade with China and India to boost their economies. And they also extracted a number of other resources from other colonies. So areas that didn't have silver or gold, they'd be able to get resources like timber, furs, sugar, tobacco. These tropical crops were especially important. You couldn't grow them in Europe itself, and so Caribbean islands became some of the most valuable colonies in the Americas. So they're very tiny on the map, but they produced a huge amount of wealth for whichever European country controlled them. And a number of these Caribbean islands changed hands numerous times during the colonial era, as one country would get the advantage over another, and in the peace treaty they would trade off colonies with each other. You also have crops from the Americas, like potatoes and maize, that were brought back to the Eastern Hemisphere and enabled a population boom to occur throughout Eurasia, because these are way more efficient crops at producing calories per acre than a lot of the existing Eastern Hemisphere crops like wheat and barley and so forth. We also see with colonialism the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. So colonialism was the time at which we invent our modern ideas of race. So the idea that the human species is divided into a small number of subspecies, biologically distinct subpopulations, was really a product of this colonial era, and it served to justify colonialism. It served to justify why white people from Europe could come steal the land of indigenous people in the Americas and kill them off or drive them out, and why they could bring Africans over to work as labor in a condition of slavery. So by inventing this idea that, well, these are biologically distinct populations of people, and one of those is a superior race of people, this was used to justify this system. And the Atlantic slave trade, bringing Africans over to the Americas during the colonial period, was distinct from earlier forms of slavery that had existed. So slavery goes back a very, very long time. It goes back to ancient Egypt and ancient Sumer. There were slave systems then. The Atlantic slave trade is distinct for a number of reasons. First, it was larger scale, just a much bigger number of people who were taken from their home societies and brought across to the Americas and kept in slavery there. So it was way bigger than slave trade that had existed within Africa and Europe and other areas previously to that. It was also distinct because it was racialized. So we have this idea that Africans are a distinct race of people who deserve to be enslaved, that make natural slaves in contrast to Europeans who shouldn't be enslaved. in the past, basically anyone could become a slave. If your society lost in a war, one of the consequences might be that you could get enslaved by the victors, and that could happen, to anybody depending just on who won that war. It was also not uncommon for people to sell themselves or their children into slavery because of debts that they had incurred and so forth. So slaves could be from any place, any group of people. But the Atlantic slave trade created this racialization of slavery where Africans should be slaves, Europeans should not be slaves because of this this idea that there were supposed inherent biological differences between these races of people. And this was also a particularly brutal form of slavery. So the Atlantic slave trade established what's sometimes called chattel slavery. So the word chattel means property, and it comes from the same root word as the word cattle, right, for cows. Because cows were one of the main forms of property and wealth that people had in the past when these words were developed. So the idea of chattel slavery is that slaves are regarded by their owners as property in kind of the same way as livestock would be. So the amount of freedom that the slaves would have was extremely limited, and they were mistreated in all kinds of different ways by their masters because they were regarded by them as being nothing more than a form of property. And opportunities for people to get out of slavery were extremely restricted. So in other slave societies that have existed, there were often routes that slaves could earn their way out of slavery. Whereas in slavery as established through the Atlantic slave trade, that was almost never possible. It was very rare that people could ever get out of slavery. Your children would be enslaved, their children would be enslaved, and so forth. So this permanent condition of being legally considered as property. Now, obviously, the people that were enslaved weren't too keen on that idea, and there was a huge amount of resistance by people who were captured into the Atlantic slave trade. The masters were in this sort of constant state of paranoia about slave uprisings, something that became an even more realistic kind of fear after the Haitian Revolution, where black Haitians rose up against their masters, kicked the French out of Haiti, and established an independent country there. So this Atlantic slave trade is very obvious negative impacts on the people who were themselves enslaved, but it also had a lot of negative impacts on the societies that they came from back in Africa. So you have the loss of healthy working age people. These are, the people that would be most valuable as slaves, so they were targeted by slave traders. They brought the largest price when they were sold. But of course, those are also the people that are most important to maintaining the economy back home. So you're losing your best workers because they were getting captured and taken away by slave traders. You also have intensified conflict among the various nations and tribes within Africa, because the best way to stop your neighbors from attacking and enslaving you was for you to attack and enslave them first. So we have breakouts of conflict among various states and tribes within Africa driven by the slave trade. And we have increased dependence on European trade goods. So capturing slaves became a major part of the economy of lots of African societies. And so then everything else that they needed was stuff they were getting from Europeans in trade for the slaves that they would sell to them. So this had a very big negative impact on African economies. And we can actually see that even up to the present day, that there is a correlation on the level of ethnic groups. So not necessarily countries, because the borders of those countries were established much later in the second phase of colonialism, but on the level of ethnic groups, we can actually still see a correlation between how hard they were hit by the slave trade in terms of number of people taken from them and current economic prosperity and levels of social trust. So this was a really big negative impact on African societies. So we have this initial wave of colonialism in the Americas, But then as we get into the later 1800s, into the beginning of the 1900s, we see European colonial empires turning towards the east. So instead of just showing up at the coast of Africa to trade for slaves and other goods, European countries began to take over the interior of Africa and divide the continent up into colonies. And then you likewise have the same thing happening in southern Asia, that European colonies get established there, and Oceania becomes colonized by Europeans. And so by this time, a lot of the Americas had eventually gained its independence, but colonialism still expands by turning to the east. Europe was now economically and militarily powerful enough to subjugate societies that had been part of that 1300s world economy. So by using the resources and wealth they got from colonialism in the Americas, European countries were able to take over the Eastern Hemisphere as well. So that's what I just said there. And so some countries remained independent. So China, for example, was never conquered by any European country. It never became a colony. But it was still subject to European economic power. So European countries were able to blockade Chinese ports. They were able to force China to sign unfavorable trade deals that gave Europeans access to Chinese goods at a favorable exchange rate. And because of this, there wasn't really a need to go through all the trouble of totally conquering China if you kind of get what you wanted from them without that. So nobody was untouched by colonialism, even though some areas were not fully taken over and turned completely into colonies. And some of the settler colonies, like the United States, also became colonial powers. So the United States, as it expanded westward, was essentially treating the West as an internal colony, much like Russia expanding into Siberia was doing. And then the United States started to expand overseas as well. The United States took over places like Puerto Rico or the Philippines and treated those as colonies as well. And when Europeans started taking over these eastern territories, so areas that had been parts of this world economy for a long time, there were attempts to deliberately destroy those colonies' economic base. So you'll remember that India was one of the cores of that world economy before European colonialism. Eventually, India was taken over first by the British East India Company, so a corporation chartered by the British government, and then that was later handed over to the British government to rule directly. One of the major products that had been coming out of India, one of its exports that had been part of its prosperity and core status in the world economy, was textiles. So textiles was a major manufacturing output from India. Textiles was also a major manufacturing output of Britain. And so when Britain took over India, one of the things they did was they banned textile imports from India. So they deliberately undercut the Indian economy in order to benefit British textile manufacturers, because now they didn't have to compete with Indian textiles. So India could still grow the cotton that textiles might be made out of, but they had to export it to Britain to have it manufactured into cloth. And then India had to buy that cloth back at a markup from Britain. So this undercut the Indian economy. So it's not just that Britain got ahead, but they actually pushed India down. They destroyed India's economic standing and impoverished India. And there were widespread famines in India during this colonial period, even as India was sometimes exporting food to Europe, because its economy was being controlled for the benefit of Britain, not for the benefit of the Indian people. Okay, so eventually, most of these colonies achieve their independence. So you have the American mainland colonies mostly gaining their independence in the 1800s, and then in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Oceania in the 1900s, especially after World War II. So post-World War II, you see this big wave of independence movements in many of these colonies that result in them being established as formally independent colonies. However, they remained in a condition of what we call neo-colonialism. So in neo-colonialism, the economic systems that were inherited from the colonial era are still there. The infrastructure for that is still there. Often these colonies, when they gain their independence, would, as part of the kind of treaty that would establish their independence, agree to sort of special trade deals with the former colonizer that would maintain some of these colonial economic structures. And in particular, this often involved primary sector production in the now former colony, so agriculture, mining, that kind of thing. And they would send that stuff cheaply to the colonizer countries, and then in exchange they would buy more expensive manufactured goods back from them. So this is that unequal exchange that we talked about, where you have this primary sector production happening in the colony and being sent cheaply to the colonizer, and then buying back these more expensive manufactured goods. This continues into the independence era and continues to hold back the economies of these former colonies. But at the same time, you have now this emphasis on development. And this is something that's being promoted both by the leaders of these newly independent countries as well as by the leaders of the former colonizer and richer countries. So development's a process of raising people's material standards of living through economic modernization. The idea is, let's get the economies of these countries to resemble the economies of the rich countries like the United States, Britain, France, etc. So we're going to try to push them along this supposed trajectory of development that they're lagging behind on. And the idea of development is often traced back to Harry Truman's second inaugural speech. So World War II was over. The United States had kind of accomplished its mission of defeating fascism. And so the big question was, well, now what's our international mission? Now what should the United States be doing on the world stage? Didn't want to be isolationist anymore like we had been prior to World War II. And so Truman proposed, and this became kind of the accepted view among U.S. leaders from then through the present, is that at least one of our missions should be to promote development in poorer countries. So there's been a number of different approaches that countries have taken to development. And so the first one that a lot of countries tried out was something called import substitution industrialization. So this is based on something called dependency theory, which is drawing on some of these ideas like unequal exchange. And it argues that poor countries remain poor due to unequal trade relationships with rich countries. That when a poor country and a rich country trade with each other, the rich country will benefit and the poor country will not benefit. That's kind of in very simple terms, the core idea from within dependency theory. And so if that's the case, then the obvious solution is, well, you should stop trading with rich countries. You should cut off that unequal trade that is harming the poor country. Countries on a similar economic level can trade with each other without creating these negative impacts, but it's the trade between the rich and the poor that, according to dependency theory, is the source of the problem. So you want to try to get rid of that trade. But you still need all the stuff that you used to get from trade. Right? If these are countries that are producing raw materials in their primary sector, but then dependent on the secondary sector manufacturing happening in the rich countries, what are they going to do? How are they going to get those manufactured goods? Well, they have to produce their own. They have to create substitutes for the things they used to import, hence import substitution. So in order to do that, to get this domestic production of imported goods up and running and protect yourself from imports of manufactured goods from the richer countries, you're going to do things like restricting foreign investment. Because if foreign investors come and invest in businesses in your country, they're going to take the profits home with them. And so you're going to lose out. So you want your economic activity to be controlled by people within your country. So these countries put up big restrictions on the amount of foreign investment they would take. There'd be rules that any enterprise has to be at least majority owned by domestic interests, even if there was some foreign capital coming in and so forth. So you have restrictions on foreign investment. You also have high tariffs and import quotas. So you want to give an advantage to your domestic production by making it harder to buy competing foreign imports, because these foreign imports might be cheaper because if those countries have the latest technology and they've been doing this for a long time, they may be able to make this stuff a lot cheaper than your new industries that you're just starting to build in your country. So you're going to put up tariffs and import quotas. So a tariff is a tax on imports. So these foreign goods might be cheaper on their own, but you slap this big tax on top of it and it equalizes it out. And so it gives an advantage to your domestic goods that don't have to pay this tariff. Or you may have a quota that simply says we'll only take in this many of this product. So we'll only take in so many cars from abroad, and that's it. That's how many you can bring in. Anybody else that wants a car has to buy a domestically produced one. So these tariffs and import quotas that are meant to protect these domestic industries while they get up and running. You also have government subsidies for, and sometimes just outright ownership of, key industries. So if you need a car company in your country because you're going to try to stop importing cars from other companies, how are you going to get it up and running? Where's the money for that going to come from? How are you going to ensure that it keeps going and doesn't go out of business? Well, if the government either heavily subsidizes it or outright owns it, you can make sure of that. The government is often the entity with the most money to invest in a poor country, right? You don't have a lot of people that are private individuals or companies that have a whole bunch of capital they can invest, but the government can access this money. So the government can subsidize or directly run a lot of these key industries that are seen as crucial for the country's economy and ones that you want to avoid having to import from anyplace else. And then going along with this, countries practicing import substitution usually had strong social safety net programs. So these are programs to redistribute the profit from all of these industries so that it can be shared more equally throughout society. So this includes things like direct welfare payments for the poor. It involves free or heavily subsidized healthcare, free or heavily subsidized education. These are all things that are aimed at spreading this wealth out to your whole society. So I want to now take a little bit of a detour to talk about the concept of the resource curse. And we've mentioned this earlier in the lesson, but it's a sort of an empirical observation about the world that countries with large, valuable natural resource bases often have worse economic performances than countries that don't have the same sort of natural resource base. And so this is something that might seem counterintuitive because, again, having lots of natural resources seems like a route to prosperity. But there are reasons that having large natural resources might not only not be enough to create prosperity, but might actually hold you back as compared to a country without that kind of resource base. So if you have one big valuable resource that your country produces, that can lead to a real failure to diversify your economy. You focus on just that one resource. You hitch your wagon to just that one resource, so you don't create this broad-based, diverse economy with lots of different kinds of economic activity, and so you don't generate a lot of economic growth for your country as a whole. So you may be bringing in a whole bunch of money off of this one resource, but you're not growing your whole economy. It's not spilling over to benefit everyone rather than just the people that control this one resource. And if this resource is controlled by the government, which it often is, because it's such a valuable thing, the government will often step in to take charge of this resource, it can lead to a lot of corruption and a patronage system. So the government is now staying in power because it's earning money from this resource and then distributing that money through this patronage system, paying people off. So they're not dependent on having a broad democratic base of support among the voters of the country. And so this can create a lot of corruption, it could create a lot of inefficient use of resources, and it stalls the economy from benefiting everybody in the country. So having a lot of resources is not a guarantee of economic prosperity. But it's also important to remember that the resource curse is not universal. It's not the case that every country with a lot of natural resources suffers from it. So if you have a strong democratic system, if your resources managed well, you can avoid the resource curse and benefit from having lots of natural resources. And so two common examples that are often pointed to as countries that have avoided a resource curse are Norway, which has enormous amounts of oil that are produced there, and Australia, which has a number of different minerals, including gold and diamonds, that are produced there. Neither of those countries have fallen into the resource curse trap. They've been able to prosper from their natural resources. But there are lots of countries that have fallen into the resource curse, and that has been one reason that many of these poorer countries, they felt like we're just going to exploit this resource as much as we can because we need the money from it, and that has led them down the resource curse kind of path. Another factor that is playing out at this time when a lot of countries are trying out import substitution is the Cold War. So the Cold War was a standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union that took place from the end of World War II. When we had been allies during World War II to beat Germany and Japan, and then suddenly found ourselves as geopolitical rivals, and it lasted from there through to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And it's called a Cold War because both countries were afraid to get into an open hot war where we were actually trying to invade each other's territory, because both countries had nuclear weapons. And we were afraid of what would happen if either side started launching nuclear weapons. The other side would have to respond in kind, and that could end up with enormous negative consequences for everyone around the world. So there was a huge amount of fear that a hot war between the United States and Soviet Union could break out and would end up going nuclear. So those of us that grew up during the 1980s remember there was this sort of persistent fear of this nuclear apocalypse. What if something goes wrong? What if somebody crosses a line that they shouldn't have crossed, and the US and Soviet Union start launching nukes at each other? And the basis for this conflict was that these two countries had competing models of development, two different ideas about how to modernize an economy and bring these higher material standards of living. Right? We had a capitalist model in the United States, we had a communist model in the Soviet Union, and both countries wanted the rest of the world to adopt our model. We wanted all these other countries that were starting to go through this economic development to follow the capitalist model. That's the U.S. Desire, and the Soviet Union wanted them to follow a more communist kind of model. And this is actually where we get the term the third world, because you have the first world, which is the United States and our close allies that got rich using the capitalist model of development. You've got the Soviet Union and their close allies that have used the communist model. They're the second world. And then the third world is all the countries that are being fought over by the first and second world, where we're trying to get them to follow our preferred path. And this was conducted through, among other things, a bunch of proxy wars. So the United States and Soviet Union wouldn't directly shoot bullets at each other, but we would supply arms and funding to groups in third world countries that we thought would be allies or that would support the US position, and the Soviet Union would do the same thing to groups they thought would be their allies. And so in one country, the United States might be supporting the government in power, and the Soviet Union might be supporting rebels trying to overthrow them. And then in the next door country, the United States might be supporting the rebels, and the Soviet Union would be supporting the government in power. And so I've got two examples there on the slide. So in Afghanistan, the Soviet Union supported the government that was a sort of a socialist government based in the urban areas of Afghanistan. And then the United States was supporting the Mujahideen, who are Islamist warriors, mostly from the rural areas. And in the case of Afghanistan, the Mujahideen eventually won, and growing out of them came the Taliban government, who the United States then eventually came in to overthrow during the Afghanistan war following 9/11, because the Taliban was sheltering Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. So supporting the Mujahideen worked in the short term to overthrow a Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan, maybe not so great in its long-run consequences. Then in Angola, you had a long-running civil war in which there was one party, the MPLA, supported by the United States, and the other party, UNITA, supported by the Soviet Union. And so in this case, the urban-rural thing gets reversed. The United States is supporting this urban-based party, and the Soviet Union is supporting the rural party. So there are these kind of proxy wars all over the world. And if you've got a proxy war happening, you've got all this money being dumped in for weapons and so forth by these two superpowers. you can see how that could inhibit economic development in countries where these proxy wars are occurring. When we get up to the 1980s, we see a lot of countries, including those that had pursued import substitution, experiencing what's called the debt crisis. So countries often took out very large loans to pay for import substitution. They borrowed large sums of money from richer countries, from international institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And they needed this money as kind of startup funds to get their import substitution going. Right? You need this upfront money to establish these various businesses that are going to produce these things that you're going to substitute for the stuff that you used to import. And import substitution generated a lot of economic growth in these countries. It modernized their industries. It got a lot of people out of poverty, but it didn't do it fast enough to pay off these debts, because you have to pay back the debt plus interest on it, and they just weren't able to keep up with that. And they were sometimes taking out additional loans to keep going while they still hadn't been able to pay off the previous loans. And the situation in terms of being able to get out from these loans was complicated by rising interest rates in the donor countries and rising oil prices, which increased the amount of money that countries needed because they needed to buy oil on the international market, and it was getting harder and harder to do as oil prices were going up during the 1970s. So because of all this, these countries ended up getting deeper and deeper into debt. And on top of that, there were a lot of losses to corruption under authoritarian regimes. So a lot of these countries were ruled by undemocratic regimes, often propped up by either the United States or the Soviet Union, depending on whose ally they were going to be. So we'd help this undemocratic government stay in place and suppress democratic movements. And then, in another country, the Soviet Union would do the same thing. And these authoritarian regimes would not necessarily invest this money wisely in things that would generate income to pay back the loan. They would spend it on secret police. They'd spend it on building an elaborate palace for the president and these kinds of things. And so eventually countries got to the point where they were going to default on their loans. Let me move my thing there so that you can see the last bullet point. So some of these countries got way in over their heads and could no longer pay back their debts. So the map there shows Latin America, which is one of the areas hit the hardest by the debt crisis. And you can see from the map there that in some countries like Mexico, Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, debt service was half or even as much as 100% of their annual GDP. And it's important to note this is debt service. So this is not the total principal on the debt, right? The total amount you'd have to pay back to clear the debt and be done. This is debt service. So this is equivalent to your monthly minimum credit card or student loan payment, right? Your credit card doesn't necessarily ask you to pay off the entire thing every month, but it says you got to make this minimum payment to stay current on it. So that's what this debt service is. So just the amount they would need to pay to stay current on their debt. Sometimes that could be as much as 100% of their annual GDP. So if they taxed everyone in their country at 100%, right, took everybody's total money, they could just barely stay current on their loans and not go into default. That's obviously not a practical thing to do, right? You can't tax all your people at 100% every year to pay off your debts. So a number of countries, starting with Mexico, announced, look, we just simply can't pay these debts. We literally do not have the money to pay these debts. What are you going to do? And so this led to countries being forced into structural adjustment policies. So their creditors would say, okay, we can't pay off the debt. We're willing to restructure this debt. Right? We're really willing to maybe forgive part of the debt. We're willing to give you better terms, reduce your expected payment amounts and stuff. But you have to make changes to your economy. You have to alter the economic policies that you've adopted. And these policy changes that countries were kind of strong-armed into by their creditors are known as structural adjustment policies. So structural adjustment policies are driven by a philosophy known as neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is a revival of classical liberal ideas that were developed in the 1800s to support policies based on free markets. So it's important in this case not to confuse the liberal in neoliberal with the way that we commonly use the term liberal in everyday conversation in the United States to mean, the political philosophy of the center left, right? So we would, in everyday speech, say, oh well, Joe Biden is a liberal, right? That's not the kind of liberal that we're talking about when we say neoliberalism, because in fact the mainstream of both the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States today is neoliberal. This neoliberal philosophy encompasses mainstream Democratic and Republican thinking. It's only when you get sort of farther out to the edges that you get people that depart from neoliberalism. So, to the left, if you go as far as people like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they would not be neoliberal. They're far enough to the left to be outside of that. And you go to the right. Donald Trump has pursued policies that are contrary to neoliberalism during his administration. But the mainstream, most leaders and elected officials in both parties in the United States would fall into this neoliberal way of thinking, that we need to fundamentally base our policies on the free markets. We can make little regulations around the edges of those, to a greater or lesser degree, depending on where you are on the political spectrum. But you're not going to directly challenge the primacy of the market as the main economic structure in the way even that both Democratic and Republican politicians might have done in the 1950s and 60s. Both parties supported things like price controls and much higher taxation rates during that period of time than would be thinkable to most mainstream politicians today from either party. So a structural adjustment policy implements this neoliberal free market idea by first opening up to foreign investment. So this is all these you're going to see are kind of the flip side of import substitution. So the idea here is to let foreign investment come in. It will spur economic activity. It will get factories up and running, and people will have jobs, and they'll spend that money in your economy, and that will boost your economic growth. Then you're going to reduce tariffs and quotas, because if a foreign company can make a good better, then your people should have access to that. They should be able to buy it, a better and cheaper thing that's produced abroad. And that will create competition that will force your domestic industries to become better. Because if an industry is protected and owned by the government, it has less incentive to do everything the most efficient way, state-of-the-art technology and everything, because it knows it can't lose out. But if it's now exposed to foreign competition, now they really have to get their stuff together and do better at producing things or risk going out of business. So you're going to get rid of those tariffs and quotas. Then you're going to privatize industries that are owned by the government. So there were lots of different industries that were owned by governments during the import substitution era that under structural adjustment they sold off to investors. They fully privatized those. They're now private companies. They will succeed or fail depending on how well they compete within that market. And you're going to reduce government budgets by cutting spending on social safety net programs. So there were big cuts to budgets. Lots of people that worked for the government got laid off in order to reduce the tax burden and make the government more efficient under structural adjustment. So you have a lot of countries going through this structural adjustment. You also have a group of countries, they're sometimes referred to as the Asian tigers, becoming much more prosperous during this period, using yet another model for how economic development can occur. So this model is a state-supported, export-oriented development model. So the idea here is that the government sponsors the development of certain key industries. So the government is taking a very active role in the economy. They are supporting and investing in certain industries that they think are key to the country's economic success. But the goal of those industries is not to supply the domestic market like it is in import substitution, but rather it's to export to richer countries and therefore bring in revenue from those richer countries by exporting to them. So it's state-supported, but export-oriented. And so the first wave of Asian tigers, the first set of countries that followed this model were countries like Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And so these countries made enormous gains in economic prosperity. Japan is probably the biggest economic success story in terms of going from being very poor to being very rich of the 20th century. And so Japan has joined countries like the United States, Britain, France, Germany in that uppermost economic tier in our world today. But at the end of World War II, Japan was not there. Japan was extremely poor. And so Japan's rapid economic growth really shocked a lot of people in the United States. And so if you read science fiction from the 70s and 80s, if you haven't, it's sort of an interesting exercise. Read some of the science fiction from the 70s and 80s, especially stuff that's like Earth in the future, not like distant planets in space. And there is this conviction among all these authors that obviously Japan is going to totally take over the world in the future. So everything is going to be Japanese culture. Japanese corporations are going to own everything in the 21st century because Japan's rise was so rapid. We're now seeing a huge growth in China. So China is now becoming the biggest and fastest growing Asian economy. And if you look at global statistics for how many people have been lifted out of poverty over the last half century or so, if you break that down, the vast bulk of that is China. So China has seen huge economic growth, and a lot of that has been associated with a shift towards a more capitalist economy. So the Chinese government still plays a really big role in Chinese economic development. So it's far more government controlled than in a place like the United States. But China has really embraced the international capitalist market, and that's played a big role in their economic growth and the rise in the Chinese economy over the last few decades. And we're now seeing some of this economic development moving into Southeast Asia because a lot of these industries that places like Japan and Taiwan were using to boost their economies were ones that worked for them because labor was really cheap. So stuff like assembling electronics, for example. So you had, during the second half of the 20th century, you had lots of electronics that were being assembled in places like Japan and Taiwan because you had a lot of cheap labor there. But as these countries get richer, people expect higher incomes, and labor gets less cheap. And so a lot of these companies then have moved, many of them to China, where labor was cheaper, and then also into Southeast Asia, into the Philippines, into Thailand, into Malaysia, chasing that cheaper labor. And so those countries have now started to see some of this Asian tiger type of growth happening there. Another phenomenon that becomes very important during this neoliberal era is free trade agreements. So, we mentioned that one of the things that comes about in a structural adjustment policy is reducing tariffs and quotas. And so that's establishing more free trade with other countries, and then opening up foreign investment. That's another element of free trade, making it easier for capital to cross national borders. So you see a whole lot of free trade agreements established. And one of the most prominent of those, and the one that most directly affects us here in the United States, was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So this came into effect, I should say 1994 on the slide there, and lasted until in the middle of 2020 when it was replaced by the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. The US-Mexico-Canada Agreement is, in broad outlines, very similar to NAFTA. So it updated some elements of the agreement. It adjusted policies with respect to certain particular industries. It had a bunch of intellectual property provisions that hadn't been as important back in the 90s, but are now more significant because of the growth of the information economy. But in broad outlines, the USMCA is fairly similar to NAFTA. So NAFTA reduced those barriers to the movement of goods and capital between countries within North America, so the three countries that were involved there. And so it had effects such as enabling the growth of maquiladoras. So maquiladoras are factories located in the northern part of Mexico, just across the border from the United States. And so those maquiladoras are taking advantage of cheaper labor in Mexico and lower regulations, and that reduces costs for compliance in Mexico. And they're possible because NAFTA enabled investors in the United States to invest in building these maquiladoras in Mexico and then to take the goods that they produce and ship them back across the border to customers in the United States. In the past, there would have been a whole bunch of barriers in the way, both to the movement of that capital down to Mexico and then tariffs on those goods coming across from Mexico back into the United States. But NAFTA made it much easier to move this manufacturing into northern Mexico. And you can actually see in Mexico that the GDP generated in their northern states along the US border is much bigger than the southern states that aren't as attractive for maquiladoras, because there'd be more transport costs to get that stuff all the way back up to the United States. Another effect has been that Mexico had to get rid of tariffs that prevented U.S. corn from being shipped into Mexico. So corn produced in the United States is much cheaper usually than corn produced in Mexico. That's partly because U.S. farming is much more mechanized, so we can take advantage of economies of scale to produce large amounts of corn on these giant Midwestern farms harvested by giant machinery and so forth. But also because the United States government subsidizes corn production. We have huge agricultural subsidies in the United States that make things like corn and wheat and soy much cheaper than they would be if they were, purely subject to the market. So you have all this cheap corn from the United States that was able to move into Mexico as a result of NAFTA. That put a lot of Mexican farmers out of work. They, couldn't compete with this cheap U.S. corn. And a lot of these farmers then decided to try to come to the United States looking for work. So you had this big increase in migration from Mexico to the United States as a result of NAFTA, because all these Mexicans were out of work. But NAFTA did not make any changes to immigration laws. So it's easy for capital to move across borders. It's easier for goods to move across borders. It's not any easier for people to move across borders. And so there were a lot of restrictions preventing these Mexicans from coming into the United States, and a lot of people started to cross over illegally. So you see this big increase in undocumented migration into the United States from Mexico as a result of NAFTA. That has now subsided because Mexico's economy overall has grown enough to absorb these people looking for work in Mexico, so there are fewer Mexicans trying to cross the border into the United States today. But for a couple decades after NAFTA started, you had just a lot of this sort of big increase in immigration from Mexico to the United States. So NAFTA is an example of a regional free trade agreement. So an agreement among a select set of countries to engage in free trade. You also have the World Trade Organization. So at a global level, we have this organization that nearly all countries are members of that tries to promote free trade at this global scale as well. So free trade has become a major component of the global economy. So neoliberalism has been this dominant philosophy for almost half a century. It has guided the development of the global economy. But we've also seen some backlash against it. We've seen people pushing back against neoliberalism and the kinds of policies that it brings along. So in richer countries, there's concern among many people about loss of manufacturing. If a factory in the United States shuts down and that production moves to a maquiladora in Mexico, that's not so great for the people in the United States that used to work at that factory. And so this concern involves both a purely economic concern in the sense of, I don't have a job, so I don't have income anymore. But there's also a cultural a cultural element to it. So a lot of people are very attached to these manufacturing jobs as being kind of real jobs, as being good jobs, jobs that people feel good about working in contrast to the other kinds of jobs that might replace them. You might find another job that may even pay just as much as the manufacturing job that was lost. But culturally, it doesn't have the same kind of prestige. So people invested a lot in the sort of cultural identity of being a wage earner in manufacturing during the middle of the 20th century, when that was the dominant sector of the U.S. economy, that secondary sector manufacturing. And so a lot of people are interested not just in getting jobs that pay well for people that have lost out when manufacturing has moved away, but specifically in bringing manufacturing back to the United States. There's a lot of talk from politicians, from both Democratic and Republican politicians, about reinvigorating American manufacturing because people have this cultural attachment to those kinds of jobs. And one expression of this has been the trade war with China that the Trump administration has engaged in. So the Trump administration has put on tariffs on Chinese goods and, essentially gone against neoliberal advocacy of free trade in an effort to undo some of these effects of the neoliberal era. And most economists believe that this trade war with China was not terribly successful. It didn't actually reinvigorate U.S. manufacturing in any way, but the fact that people supported this and that Trump thought it was a good idea and that his voters supported him doing this shows that there's a lot of discontent with the effects of neoliberalism out there. In poorer countries, there's a lot of concern about rising inequality and control of resources by foreign investors that has been brought about by neoliberalism. So we've seen in a number of countries governments being elected that have tried to push back against neoliberalism. They've tried to undo structural adjustment policies in their country. And so the example that I've got in the sub-bullet points there is Evo Morales, who was president of Bolivia from 2006 through 2019, and there was a extremely disputed election in 2019 that I don't have time to get into all the specifics of, but the person that ultimately became the next president of Bolivia after Morales was prevented from running for a fourth term was one of his ministers in his government. So it's likely that these kind of anti-neoliberal policies that Morales instituted probably going to continue in Bolivia based on who their new president is. So he's widely noted as being the country's first indigenous president. He's from the Aymara indigenous group. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And so a lot of his policies were based on the idea of protecting indigenous people and campesinos, which is the Spanish for people that live and work in the countryside, from some of the effects of neoliberalism. And in particular, he resisted privatization of resources like natural gas and water. So there's a big push to privatize these things, to hand them over to foreign investors in countries like Bolivia and other Latin American countries. And Morales was one of the big people pushing back against that and trying to prevent those policies from being implemented in his country. So then the last topic that I want to talk a little bit about is the role of foreign aid. So one of the most obvious ways that people in richer parts of the world might promote development in poorer areas is to just simply give them money, right? To just hand over money, whether that be from government aid policies, like the United States has the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, that gives out a lot of this money, or through non-governmental organizations, things like Oxfam, or a lot of churches have these foreign aid charity kind of programs that they run. So this seems like an obvious thing, right? Just if they're poor, let's give them some money. And that can be from out of charitable motives, right? You feel bad for people who are poor and want to help them. And it can also be self-interested. You want these countries to grow so that they can be trade partners and buy more of your stuff. You're worried that if countries are poor, they might be subject to political instability that could spill over into terrorism. So there's self-interested motives as well as charitable or altruistic motives. But foreign aid does not always work as promised. So it very often comes with strings attached. So the people that receive that foreign aid are expected to do various things in response to that. So, government foreign aid often comes with strings attached in terms of policies that they expect the recipient country to adopt. Right? So that fits into the way that structural adjustment was often forced on countries by creditors they owed money to. The same thing can happen with foreign aid, that if you want this money, you got to adopt this or that policy. That may not be a good policy for the recipient, but it's probably one that's good for the donor. Or the donor may be well-meaning, may think that, well, this policy is good for you and I'm going to sort of strong-arm you into adopting it with this foreign aid. But maybe the donor doesn't actually know what they're talking about and they don't actually know what's a good policy for the recipient. So it can come with a lot of strings attached that may be bad for the recipient on the sort of an individual charity kind of level. If money is being given out to individuals, there may again be strings attached. They may expect you to change your farming practices in certain ways that may or may not actually be advantageous for you. Religious organizations may expect you to convert your religion in order to receive this foreign aid. So a lot of different kinds of strings that come attached to foreign aid. And it's often done in inappropriate ways, that countries and people are given things that they don't actually need or that can actually be harmful to them. And so they can be expected to, for example, adopt farming practices that are not actually what's going to be best for them. So, they may be expected to adopt a new high technology kind of seeds or fertilizer that's not really appropriate for their location, but the only aid they're being given is these seeds and fertilizer that somebody else wants them to start growing. And it can also undercut the local economy. So this is a major problem with food aid. So this is a common thing. There's been some sort of disaster someplace, and the impulse is often, well, we've got all of this food. Let's send them all this food so that people don't starve. And in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, that may be a good thing because it's the only way that people might get fed. But in the longer run, if you are dumping all of this free food into a country, that's going to undercut all of the people in that country whose line of work is farming and producing food. You see it with clothing donations as well. So, some organizations will collect clothing donations and send them to poorer countries with the idea being, well, now we're going to help people have clothes. And, aside from whether those clothes are even, appropriate or something that people would really want, if they are something people want, then that can put local clothing manufacturers out of business because it's hard to compete with free stuff. So foreign aid can have negative effects on the local economy, especially if it's this kind of in-kind aid that's going to compete directly with local production. So that brings us to the end there. I know that was a little longer lecture, and we had a lot of stuff to cover, but hopefully you learned something from that, and I'll see you next time.